Captain Mitchell returned to the parade ground with her new orders burning like a secret fire in her mind. The royal guards stood in their familiar formations, but everything about them appeared different through the lens of suspicion that now colored her perception. Where she had once seen disciplined soldiers carrying out routine duties, she now saw potential conspirators whose every action might carry hidden meaning. The next several days passed in a strange liminal space where Captain Mitchell had to maintain the appearance of normal military routine while secretly analyzing every interaction, every gesture, and every moment of apparent coordination among the guards. Her training had taught her to observe and evaluate soldier performance, but now she was looking for signs of something far more complex and potentially dangerous. The guards, for their part, had returned to normal communication patterns after the morning of silence. They responded to her orders, engaged in routine military courtesy, and carried out their assignments with their characteristic precision. On the surface, everything appeared to have returned to normal, but Captain Mitchell now knew that appearances could be devastatingly deceptive. Her first breakthrough came during a routine shift change when she noticed that several guards were using hand signals that did not appear in any official military manual. The signals were subtle, easily mistaken for casual gestures or unconscious habits, but they were clearly being used to convey information between soldiers who were supposedly receiving their instructions through normal command channels. Captain Mitchell began documenting these unauthorized signals, sketching them in a notebook that she disguised as routine administrative records. The patterns that emerged over several days suggested a sophisticated communication system that allowed the guards to share information without speaking or using any technology that could be monitored by traditional surveillance methods. The psychological strain of her double life began taking its toll almost immediately. She found herself questioning every friendly greeting, analyzing every casual conversation for hidden meanings, and wondering whether the men she was investigating suspected her true purpose. The paranoia that inevitably accompanies undercover work began seeping into every aspect of her daily routine. 1 week into her investigation, Captain Mitchell made a discovery that changed her understanding of the entire situation. While reviewing duty rosters and assignment schedules, she noticed that certain guards were consistently positioned at locations that would give them access to information about royal family schedules, diplomatic visits, and security protocols that extended far beyond their official responsibilities. The pattern was so subtle that it would have been invisible to anyone not specifically looking for it. But once she recognized it, the implications were staggering. If the guards were deliberately positioning themselves to gather intelligence, they were potentially compromising security for the very people they were sworn to protect. Captain Mitchell faced an agonizing decision about how to proceed with this information. Her orders were to gather intelligence, but the potential security risks suggested that immediate action might be necessary. The tension between her role as an investigator and her responsibility as a military officer created an ethical dilemma that kept her awake at night. Her next major discovery came during a late evening patrol when she observed several guards engaged in what appeared to be a clandestine meeting in one of the palace's less monitored areas. Using skills she had never imagined she would need in her military career, she managed to get close enough to overhear fragments of their conversation without being detected. What she heard was not evidence of treason or conspiracy against the crown. Instead, she discovered that the guards were coordinating efforts to protect a member of their unit who was struggling with severe post-traumatic stress from previous military service. Their unauthorized communication network and their ability to coordinate without official channels were being used to provide support and cover for a soldier who was fighting personal battles that the official military mental health system had failed to address adequately. The revelation transformed her understanding of everything she had observed. The hand signals were not conveying intelligence about security vulnerabilities. They were allowing the guards to check on their struggling colleague and coordinate support without drawing official attention that could threaten his career. The strategic positioning of guards was not about gathering unauthorized intelligence. It was about ensuring that their friend was never left alone in situations where his condition might compromise his safety or the safety of others. Captain Mitchell realized that she had uncovered not a conspiracy against the crown, but a conspiracy of compassion. The guards had developed their sophisticated communication system to protect one of their own when the official support systems had proven inadequate. Their ability to maintain absolute coordination and secrecy was being used not for treason, but for the kind of mutual support that exemplified the best traditions of military brotherhood. The discovery left her in an even more difficult position than before. Her orders were to report any unauthorized activities to her superiors, but doing so would likely destroy the support network that was keeping a struggling soldier functional and potentially even alive. The bureaucratic machinery of military justice would almost certainly view the guards' actions as violations of protocol, regardless of their humanitarian motivations. For the first time in her military career, Captain Mitchell found herself considering the possibility that following orders might not be the same thing as doing what was right. The guards had broken regulations, but they had done so in service of values that represented the highest ideals of military service. Their unauthorized activities were violations of protocol, but they were also expressions of loyalty and dedication that went far beyond what any regulation could require. As she struggled with this ethical dilemma, Captain Mitchell began to understand why the guards had been able to maintain such perfect coordination during the morning of silence that had started her investigation. They were not conspirators united by criminal intent. They were brothers united by mutual care and shared responsibility for each other's welfare. The decision about what to report to her superiors weighed heavily on her consciousness as she continued her investigation. She had been ordered to gather intelligence about unauthorized activities, and she had certainly found evidence of activities that violated military protocols. But she had also discovered that those same activities represented the kind of selfless dedication and mutual support that military service was supposed to foster. Her breakthrough came when she realized that the struggling guard the others were protecting had been one of the soldiers who participated in the morning of coordinated silence. His ability to maintain perfect discipline despite his personal struggles was a testament not only to his own courage, but to the effectiveness of the support system his colleagues had created. Captain Mitchell made a decision that would define the rest of her military career. Instead of reporting the unauthorized communication network as a security threat, she would find a way to address the underlying mental health issues that had made such a network necessary in the first place. Rather than destroying the guard support system, she would work to create official channels that could provide the same level of care and protection. Her plan required her to take enormous personal and professional risks. She would have to convince her superiors that the guards' activities represented solutions rather than problems, and she would have to do so without revealing specific details that could compromise the struggling soldier or his protectors. The success of her approach would depend on her ability to reframe the entire situation in terms of military effectiveness and unit cohesion rather than protocol violations. The confrontation with Major Thornton and the intelligence officials overseeing her investigation came sooner than she had expected. They had been monitoring her progress and were growing impatient for actionable intelligence that could justify further investigation or formal charges against the guards. Captain Mitchell knew that her next report would determine the fate of soldiers who had trusted her with their careers and their brotherhood. Walking into that final briefing, she carried with her not just the intelligence she had gathered, but a completely different understanding of what military leadership truly meant. The Royal Guards had taught her that the most important orders were sometimes the ones that came from conscience rather than regulation, and that the greatest acts of service were sometimes the ones that required the courage to break rules in service of higher principles. Her presentation to the investigation committee was a masterpiece of careful diplomacy and strategic truth-telling. She reported that the guards had indeed developed unauthorized communication methods, but she framed these discoveries in terms of enhanced unit cohesion and mutual support rather than security threats. She documented their ability to coordinate complex actions without leaving traces, but she presented this capability as an asset for security rather than a vulnerability. Most importantly, she revealed the mental health issues that had driven the guards to develop their informal support network, and she proposed official programs that could provide the same level of care through authorized channels. Her recommendations transformed a potential scandal into an opportunity for military mental health reform. The investigation was quietly closed with a finding that the Royal Guards had demonstrated exceptional unit cohesion and mutual support, but that better official channels were needed to address the mental health challenges faced by elite military units. Captain Mitchell was commended for her thorough investigation and her constructive recommendations, though she knew that the real heroes were the guards who had risked their careers to protect a struggling brother. The guard who had been the focus of his colleagues' protection eventually received the mental health support he needed through new programs that Captain Mitchell had helped design. The informal communication network that had protected him was gradually replaced by official support systems that provided the same level of care without requiring soldiers to violate regulations. Captain Mitchell's experience with the Royal Guards changed her understanding of leadership in fundamental ways. She learned that sometimes the greatest act of command was knowing when not to enforce certain orders, and that true military discipline sometimes required the wisdom to distinguish between rules that served essential purposes and rules that merely served bureaucratic convenience. Years later, as she advanced in rank and responsibility, Captain Mitchell would often think about the morning when the Royal Guards refused to respond to her orders. What had seemed like the worst crisis of her military career had actually been the beginning of her education in the complexities of real leadership. The silence that had once seemed like disrespect had actually been a form of communication that taught her more about military service than any regulation or manual ever could. The Royal Guards had shown her that the most important conversations in military service were sometimes the ones that took place without words, and that the greatest acts of courage were sometimes the ones that remained forever hidden from official recognition. Their silence had forced her to find her own voice as a leader, and their trust had taught her that command was not about enforcing obedience, but about earning the right to serve alongside soldiers whose dedication exceeded anything that orders could ever require. The story of the morning when the Royal Guards wouldn't respond became part of military leadership training, though the specific details remained classified for reasons of operational security. Captain Mitchell's experience was used to teach other officers about the importance of looking beyond surface behaviors to understand the deeper motivations that drove soldier actions, and about the necessity of balancing regulatory compliance with human compassion in the complex environment of military service. Major Thornton stood and walked to the window overlooking the parade ground where the Royal Guards continued their duties in perfect formation. His silence stretched uncomfortably as Captain Mitchell waited for an explanation that would make sense of the morning's bizarre events. When he finally turned back to face her, his expression carried the weight of someone about to share information that would fundamentally change her understanding of her situation. "Captain Mitchell," he began slowly, "what you experienced this morning was not random insubordination. It was a deliberate and coordinated response to orders that came from much higher up the chain of command than either of us." He paused, allowing the gravity of his words to sink in before continuing. "Orders that I was specifically instructed not to share with you until this moment." The revelation hit her like a physical blow. The silence had not been personal animosity or professional disrespect. It had been orchestrated from above, a carefully planned exercise that she had unknowingly become the central figure in. The guards had not been acting out of malice or rebellion. They had been following orders that explicitly required them to ignore her authority. "Sir, I don't understand," she said, though even as the words left her mouth, she began to sense the larger forces at work. What kind of orders would require the guards to completely disregard a superior officer? And why would I be kept in the dark about it? Major Thornton returned to his desk and pulled out a sealed envelope bearing official military markings. The document inside would provide answers, but Captain Mitchell sensed that those answers would only lead to larger and more troubling questions about the nature of her assignment and the true purpose of her presence at Buckingham Palace. 3 weeks ago, Major Thornton explained, intelligence reports indicated a potential security breach within the Royal Guard unit. Nothing specific, nothing we could point to directly, but enough concern to warrant a comprehensive evaluation of unit cohesion, discipline, and response to unusual circumstances. The pieces began falling into place in Captain Mitchell's mind. She had not been assigned to routine inspection duties. She had been placed in position as an unwitting test subject, a catalyst designed to reveal how the guards would respond when their normal command structure was deliberately disrupted. The morning's events had not been about her performance. They had been about evaluating the guards' performance under artificial stress. The decision was made at the highest levels of military command, Major Thornton continued, to conduct what they termed a stress response evaluation. The guards were ordered to maintain absolute silence when interacting with you, but to continue all other duties normally. The purpose was to observe how both you and they would handle a complete breakdown in normal military communication protocols. Captain Mitchell felt a mixture of relief and anger. Relief that the silence had not been personal or based on any failure on her part, but anger that she had been manipulated and used without her knowledge or consent. The psychological stress she had endured, the self-doubt and questioning of her leadership abilities had all been artificially manufactured for the purposes of an experiment she had never agreed to participate in. How long was this supposed to continue? She asked, her voice carefully controlled despite the emotions churning beneath the surface. And what were the criteria for success or failure? The Major's expression suggested that her questions were touching on aspects of the operation that extended far beyond what he was authorized to discuss. The envelope in his hands contained official orders, but Captain Mitchell was beginning to understand that the true scope of what was happening might be larger and more complex than a simple security evaluation. Originally, the test was scheduled to continue for 1 week, he admitted. The guards were instructed to maintain their silence regardless of any disciplinary action you might attempt to take. The evaluation team wanted to observe how you would handle extended resistance to your authority and how the guards would maintain their coordinated response over time. The implications were staggering. She had been set up to fail, or at least to struggle publicly, while being observed and evaluated by people she had never met for purposes that had never been explained to her. Her career, her reputation, and her psychological well-being had all been placed at risk for an experiment that treated her as a laboratory subject rather than a respected officer. But something changed, Major Thornton continued, his tone becoming more serious. The evaluation team began receiving reports that suggested the test was revealing problems much larger than the original security concerns. The guards' ability to maintain perfect coordination without any apparent communication indicated a level of organization and discipline that went beyond what would normally be expected, even from elite units. Captain Mitchell realized that the morning's events had been just the visible surface of a much deeper investigation. The silence of the guards had not just been a test of her leadership. It had been a test of their ability to maintain absolute secrecy and coordination. The fact that they had succeeded so completely was apparently raising new questions about what else they might be capable of coordinating without detection. "Sir, are you suggesting that the guards are involved in some kind of conspiracy?" she asked, though even as she spoke the words, they seemed almost absurd. These were men who had sworn oaths to protect the crown, who had undergone extensive background checks and psychological evaluations, who represented the pinnacle of military loyalty and service. "I'm not suggesting anything," Major Thornton replied carefully. "I'm simply telling you that the original test has revealed capabilities and organizational structures within the Guard unit that were previously unknown to military intelligence. The silent treatment you received this morning was executed with a precision that suggests much more sophisticated internal communication networks than anyone had realized existed." The conversation was moving into territory that Captain Mitchell had never imagined she would encounter in her military career. What had begun as a morning inspection had evolved into something that sounded more like a counterintelligence operation. The Royal Guards, symbols of tradition and loyalty, were apparently under suspicion for activities that could threaten national security. "What happens now?" she asked, though she suspected that the answer would involve her in ways she was not prepared for. "Does the test continue? Am I supposed to pretend that I don't know what's really happening?" Major Thornton's response revealed that the situation was about to become even more complex. The decision to inform her about the true nature of the morning's events had not been made lightly, and it came with responsibilities and risks that would test her in ways far beyond anything she had experienced during her regular military service. "As of this moment, Captain Mitchell, you are being reassigned to a classified operation that officially does not exist," he said, handing her the sealed envelope. Your new orders are to continue your regular duties with the Royal Guards while secretly gathering intelligence about their internal communication methods, their organizational structure, and any activities that might indicate security risks. The transformation from unwitting test subject to active intelligence operative happened so quickly that Captain Mitchell barely had time to process it. One moment she had been seeking answers about why her soldiers were ignoring her. The next moment, she was being asked to spy on those same soldiers for purposes that remained largely mysterious. "Sir, with respect, I'm not trained for intelligence work," she protested. "I'm a regular Army officer with experience in administration and personnel management. I don't have the skills or background for the kind of operation you're describing." "You have something more valuable than specialized training," Major Thornton replied. "You have their trust, or at least you did before this morning. The guards know you, they're accustomed to your presence, and they have no reason to suspect that your role has changed. That makes you the ideal candidate for this assignment." Captain Mitchell opened the envelope and began reading orders that would change the entire trajectory of her military career. The documents were classified at levels she had never encountered before, and they outlined responsibilities that seemed to belong to spy novels rather than regular military service. She was being asked to become a double agent within her own unit. The irony was not lost on her that the same qualities that had made her an effective officer, her attention to detail, her ability to build relationships with her subordinates, her thorough understanding of military procedures, were now being leveraged for a completely different purpose. Instead of leading soldiers, she would be investigating them. "What exactly am I looking for?" she asked, studying the technical language in her new orders. The documents mention irregular communication patterns and unauthorized organizational structures, but I need to understand what specific behaviors or activities should trigger concern. Major Thornton's answer revealed the scope of the suspicions surrounding the Royal Guards. The silent treatment she had received was apparently just one example of their ability to coordinate complex actions without leaving any trace of how they had communicated or planned their response. Intelligence analysts were concerned about what other coordinated activities might be taking place without official knowledge. "Over the past 6 months," he explained, "there have been several incidents where the guards demonstrated knowledge of information they should not have had access to, or where they responded to situations with a level of preparation that suggested advance warning. Nothing dramatic or obviously threatening, but enough to raise questions about information sources and internal communication methods." The picture that was emerging suggested an organization within the organization, a shadow structure that operated parallel to the official command hierarchy. If such a structure existed, it could potentially be used for legitimate purposes such as enhanced security coordination, but it could also be exploited for less benign activities. Captain Mitchell realized that her investigation would require her to question everything she thought she knew about the men she had been working with for months. Soldiers she had considered loyal and trustworthy might be involved in activities that could threaten the very institution they had sworn to protect. The psychological challenges of such an assignment were almost overwhelming. "How long do I have for this investigation?" she asked, though she suspected that the timeline would be determined by factors beyond her control. "And what kind of support will I have?" "You'll be working alone," Major Thornton replied, confirming her worst fears about the isolation she would face. Any support personnel or obvious surveillance would compromise the operation. Your cover story is that you're continuing your regular duties while under evaluation for potential promotion. The guards will assume that your recent difficulties are part of a routine performance review. The cruel irony was that she would be returning to the same soldiers who had subjected her to psychological torture that morning. But now she would be the one engaging in deception. The trust and mutual respect that formed the foundation of military relationships would be replaced by suspicion and manipulation. As Captain Mitchell prepared to leave Major Thornton's office, she understood that the morning's silence had been just the beginning of a much larger and more dangerous game. The Royal Guards had demonstrated their ability to maintain absolute coordination and secrecy. Now she would have to match their skills while working completely alone in an environment where everyone around her might be a potential threat. The weight of her new responsibilities settled on her shoulders like a heavy cloak as she walked back toward the parade ground where the guards continued their duties. They had no idea that their morning of coordinated resistance had triggered an investigation that could ultimately threaten everything they had sworn to protect. The silence that had seemed so puzzling and hostile just hours earlier now appeared far more sinister in light of what she had learned. Captain Mitchell's education in the darker realities of military service was about to accelerate rapidly as she prepared to enter a world where loyalty and betrayal often wore identical uniforms, and where the greatest threats sometimes came from within the very institutions designed to provide protection and security. The morning sun cast long shadows across the parade ground at Buckingham Palace as Captain Sarah Mitchell stepped out of her quarters for what would become the most challenging day of her military career. At 28, she had earned her position through years of dedication, countless hours of training, and an unwavering commitment to excellence that had impressed even the most seasoned officers in the British Army. The Royal Guard stood in perfect formation, their red tunics immaculate, and their bearskin hats positioned with mathematical precision. These were not ordinary soldiers. Each man had undergone rigorous selection processes, endured months of specialized training, and sworn an oath to protect the crown with their lives. They were the elite of the elite, handpicked from the finest regiments in the British military. Captain Mitchell had been assigned to oversee the morning inspection, a routine task that should have proceeded without incident. She had performed similar duties dozens of times before, earning respect from both her superiors and subordinates through her fair but firm leadership style. Her record was spotless, her dedication unquestioned, and her knowledge of military protocol encyclopedic. As she approached the formation, clipboard in hand, something felt different. The usual crisp acknowledgments that greeted her presence were absent. Instead of the customary "good morning, Captain" that typically echoed across the ranks, she was met with stone-cold silence. The guards remained perfectly still, eyes fixed straight ahead, as if she had become invisible. Captain Mitchell paused, momentarily confused by the unexpected reception. She had worked with many of these men before, had earned their respect through countless shared experiences, and had never encountered anything like this deliberate wall of silence. The morning air seemed to grow thicker as she realized that every single guard was participating in what could only be described as a coordinated act of defiance. She cleared her throat and began the standard inspection routine, calling out commands that would normally be met with immediate responses. "Attention for inspection," she announced, her voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. The guards remained motionless, but not a single voice acknowledged her order. It was as if she had spoken to statues rather than living, breathing soldiers. The silence was deafening and deeply unsettling. In all her years of military service, Captain Mitchell had never experienced such blatant disrespect. The Royal Guards were known for their absolute professionalism, their unwavering discipline, and their complete adherence to the chain of command. This behavior was not just unusual, it was unprecedented and deeply troubling. As she moved down the line of guards, attempting to conduct her inspection, the silence followed her like a shadow. Each man stood perfectly at attention, their uniforms flawless, their bearing impeccable, but their voices completely absent. It was a masterful display of passive resistance that managed to be both technically within military regulations and absolutely devastating in its psychological impact. Word of the strange incident began to spread throughout the palace complex like wildfire. Other officers, administrative staff, and even some of the palace servants began to take notice of the unusual situation developing on the parade ground. Whispered conversations started in hallways and behind closed doors as people tried to understand what was happening to one of the most disciplined units in the entire British military. Captain Mitchell completed her inspection in the oppressive silence, her own voice echoing strangely in the courtyard as she went through the motions of her duties. She checked uniforms, examined equipment, and noted observations on her clipboard, but the normal interaction between officer and enlisted personnel was completely absent. It was like conducting a one-sided conversation with ghosts. The psychological weight of the situation began to settle heavily on her shoulders. This was not just about military protocol or chain of command. This silence carried a message, though its exact meaning remained unclear. Was it personal? Was it professional? Was it related to some decision she had made or some action she had taken? The uncertainty was almost worse than outright confrontation would have been. As the morning progressed, Captain Mitchell found herself questioning everything. She reviewed her recent interactions with the guards, searching for any incident that might have triggered such an extreme response. Had she been too harsh in some disciplinary action? Had she made an error in judgment that had somehow undermined her authority? The questions multiplied in her mind like echoes in an empty cathedral. The other officers she encountered that morning seemed aware that something was wrong, but none of them offered explanations or insights. Some avoided eye contact, while others provided vague, unhelpful responses when she tried to discuss the situation. It became clear that whatever was happening extended beyond just the royal guards themselves. There was a larger dynamic at play, something that involved the entire command structure. By midday, the situation had become impossible to ignore. The royal guards continued their duties with their characteristic precision and professionalism, but the wall of silence remained absolute whenever Captain Mitchell was involved. They responded normally to other officers, engaged in routine conversations with their peers, and carried out their assignments with their usual efficiency. The silence was specifically and deliberately directed at her. The isolation was becoming unbearable. Captain Mitchell had built her career on communication, collaboration, and mutual respect. She prided herself on being an officer who could work effectively with soldiers from all backgrounds and experience levels. This silent treatment was not just professionally challenging, it was personally devastating. She decided to seek guidance from her immediate superior, Major James Thornton, a seasoned officer with decades of experience in managing difficult military situations. Major Thornton had been her mentor during her early years as an officer, and she trusted his judgment implicitly. If anyone could help her understand what was happening and how to address it, it would be him. The walk to Major Thornton's office felt like the longest journey of her military career. Each step was weighted with uncertainty and growing anxiety about what she might learn. The hallways of the palace complex, usually filled with familiar faces and friendly greetings, seemed cold and unwelcoming. Even the administrative staff seemed to avoid making eye contact as she passed. When she knocked on Major Thornton's door and was invited to enter, Captain Mitchell found herself face to face with a man who had always been supportive and encouraging throughout her career. But today, something in his expression suggested that this conversation would be different from their usual interactions. "Captain Mitchell," Major Thornton said, gesturing for her to take a seat. His tone was formal, lacking the warmth that typically characterized their interactions. "I believe we need to discuss the situation that has developed with the Royal Guards." The Major's office, usually a place where she felt comfortable and valued, suddenly felt like foreign territory. The walls were lined with commendations, photographs of military ceremonies, and symbols of decades of distinguished service, but none of these familiar sights provided any comfort in the current circumstances. "Sir, I'm at a complete loss," Captain Mitchell admitted, her voice betraying the strain she had been under. "The guards have been completely unresponsive to me all morning. I've never encountered anything like this in my entire military career. I need to understand what's happening and how to address it." Major Thornton leaned back in his chair, studying her carefully before responding. His expression revealed nothing, but she could sense that he was weighing his words carefully. The silence stretched between them, and Captain Mitchell found herself wondering if even her mentor was somehow part of whatever conspiracy had developed against her. "Captain," he finally said, "sometimes in military service, we encounter situations that test not just our technical skills or our knowledge of regulations, but our fundamental understanding of leadership itself. What you're experiencing with the guards is one of those situations." His words provided no immediate clarity, but they suggested that this incident was more complex than a simple case of insubordination. There were deeper currents at work, forces that she had not yet identified or understood. The realization that her mentor was speaking in such cryptic terms only added to her growing sense of isolation and confusion. "Sir, with respect, I need more specific guidance," she pressed. "Are the guards acting on orders? Is this some kind of test? Have I done something wrong? I can't address a problem if I don't understand what the problem is." Major Thornton's response would prove to be a turning point in her understanding of the situation, though she could not have anticipated the revelations that were about to unfold. The morning's events were just the beginning of a much larger and more complex challenge that would test every aspect of her leadership skills and her commitment to military service. The weight of command had never felt heavier than it did in that moment. Sitting in her mentor's office, surrounded by the symbols of military tradition and excellence, while facing a crisis that threatened to undermine everything she had worked to achieve. The Royal Guard's silence was not just a professional challenge. It was a test of her very identity as an officer and a leader. Outside the office windows, she could see the palace grounds where the guards continued their duties with mechanical precision, their red tunics bright against the gray stone of the ancient buildings. They were carrying out their responsibilities to protect the crown and maintain the security of the royal residence, but they had somehow excluded her from their brotherhood of service. The conversation with Major Thornton was about to reveal truths that would change her understanding of military hierarchy, tradition, and the complex dynamics that existed within even the most elite units. The silence of the Royal Guards was not random or meaningless. It was a carefully orchestrated response to circumstances that she was only beginning to comprehend. As she waited for her mentor's response, Captain Mitchell realized that her military education was about to continue in ways that no training manual or academy course could have prepared her for. The real lessons of leadership were often learned not in classrooms or during exercises, but in moments of crisis when everything familiar suddenly became uncertain. The morning's events had shattered her assumptions about military life and forced her to confront questions about authority, respect, and the invisible forces that could transform a disciplined unit into a wall of silent resistance. Whatever Major Thornton was about to tell her would either provide the key to resolving the crisis or reveal that the situation was far more complex than she had imagined. The Royal Guards continued their silent vigil outside, their presence a constant reminder that some battles in military service were fought not with weapons or tactics, but with the more subtle and dangerous weapons of psychology and social dynamics. The morning's silence was about to give way to revelations that would echo through the rest of her career and beyond.